Good evening, and welcome wherever you are listening from, whether this story finds you late at night, in a quiet room with the lights dimmed, or during a calm moment of rest. And before we continue, I want to gently wish you a peaceful and warm Christmas, one spent as close as possible to the people you love, or at least wrapped in a sense of calm, safety, and reflection. And I want to thank you sincerely for choosing to spend this quiet time with us, for listening, for resting your thoughts here for a while, and for allowing these forgotten lives from the past to be heard again. Your presence matters more than you may realize, and stories like this exist because someone, somewhere, is willing to listen. Now, let us return softly to Victorian London. Charlie stepped out into the narrow street below the garret just as the pale winter morning began to widen into day. The stones underfoot slick with mud, and yesterday's rain, the air sharp but not cruel, carrying that strange December stillness that settles over the city when even the busiest streets seem to pause, as though holding their breath before the long holiday. He walked quickly, not because he was eager, but because standing still meant feeling the cold creep upward through the thin soles of his boots, one of which was little more than pasteboard now, softened by damp and threatening to give way with every step. And as he moved he thought not of himself, but of his parents waiting in the dim attic, of his father's laboured breathing, of his mother's tired hands folded quietly in her lap, and of how little it would take to make the day less bitter for them, just a warm meal, just something more than bread and water. The idea that returned to him again and again was the crossing near the busy thoroughfare, a place where boots and carriage wheels churned mud endlessly, and where a boy with a broom might earn a few precious coins if fortune smiled, for Charlie had seen the regular sweeper there more than once with a handful of halfpence, and sometimes even silver, enough to buy peas pudding thick and warm, a luxury that lingered in the memory long after the taste was gone. As he approached the crossing, he arrived before its usual owner, standing quietly with his cap in his hand, pretending indifference while hope tightened in his chest. And when the other boy finally appeared, sharp-eyed and quick-witted from years of hard living, Charlie spoke plainly, asking if there might be work for him that morning, and though the answer came slowly and with suspicion, persistence won him a single penny and the chance to sweep. The work was filthy, the broom little more than a bundle of worn twigs, scattering mud as much as clearing it, soaking his clothes, and sending cold water seeping through his broken boot. Yet Charlie worked with care and patience, knowing that care was sometimes all a person had left to offer, and when the job was done, he held the penny tightly in his hand as though it was something fragile and precious. From there the day unfolded in fragments, opening cab doors, holding horses, running errands when asked, each small task adding a copper to his pocket. Never enough to feel secure, but enough to keep hope alive, and by the time the afternoon crept closer, with the sky beginning to darken and the streets filling again, Charlie counted his earnings carefully, calculating what might be possible, what might be stretched, and whether, just perhaps, there could be something warm waiting at home when he returned. It was then, thinking of the crossing once more, and of the crowds that passed there between 4 and 5 o'clock, that he made his way back through the wet streets, unaware that this ordinary decision, made from hunger and necessity, would carry him into the most difficult trial of the day, and quietly, without his knowing it yet, toward the moment that would test not only his endurance, but the honesty he had been taught since childhood. The afternoon wore on quietly, and with it the light began to thin, the pale winter sun retreating behind a veil of cloud, as if reluctant to remain above the city, and Charlie, clutching his small bundle of coins, made his way back toward the crossing with careful steps, mindful not to slip in the deepening mud, his thoughts fixed on the narrow window of time when people returning from work might be generous, or at least hurried enough to toss a coin without much thought. When the regular sweeper handed him the broom at 3 o'clock and disappeared to enjoy his own warm meal, Charlie took his place with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, standing straight, touching his cap politely, doing his best to appear capable and deserving, though the work was new to him and his movements lacked the practiced rhythm of someone long accustomed to the trade. For a while people passed without noticing him at all, boots splashing through puddles, skirts lifted hurriedly, umbrellas angled against the sky, and the silence of neglect pressed on him more heavily than the cold, until suddenly, without warning, a few coins dropped into his hand, small sounds of metal that felt almost miraculous in their unexpected kindness. One moment in particular stayed with him, though he did not yet know why, when he noticed a lady waiting to cross with a little girl beside her, the child's fair hair bright even under the grey sky, and something in their hesitation moved him to act without thinking of payment at all, so he stepped forward and guided them safely across, returning to his place before he even thought to look back. It was only when the lady called him gently that he turned, startled, and received a small silver coin, but more than that, a look of warmth that lingered in his mind long after they were gone, reminding him of pictures he had once seen in shop windows, images of angels and shepherds, and of a world kinder than the one he knew. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the rain returned. Dark spots appeared on the stones, spreading quickly, merging into one another until the gutters hissed and gurgled, and the street filled with motion and noise, cabs rolling steadily through sheets of water, people no longer pausing, no longer lingering, intent only on getting home, while Charlie stood soaked through, his clothes heavy, his hands numb, unable to leave his post because the broom itself was not his to lose. By the time 5 o'clock came and the regular sweeper returned, laughing at his misfortune and reclaiming his pitch, Charlie's spirits had sunk, though not entirely broken, for even disappointment had become something he knew how to carry, and he moved on again, trying once more to open cab doors, to make himself useful, to find any small task that might yield another penny. But the streets were harsher now. Older boys pushed him aside, voices grew sharp, and when a policeman finally ordered him to move on, suspicion in his tone, fear rose swiftly in Charlie's chest, for the thought of spending Christmas Eve in a station house was more than he could bear, and he ran, heart pounding, through the wet streets toward home. As he went, his eyes, trained by long necessity, searched the ground, for he knew that his shoes would need repairing again before morning, and even now he could feel the cold water pressing through the weakened sole, and so when he spotted a small scrap lying near the edge of the pavement, he stooped and picked it up without hesitation, thinking only that it might serve to stop the hole for a little while longer. It was only later in the dim attic, when the rain tapped steadily above and his parents watched silently, that he unfolded the damp paper and realized with a shock that stole his breath that what he held was not rubbish at all, but money, more money than he had ever seen in his life, notes whose value he scarcely dared to imagine. And in that moment, standing there with hunger twisting inside him and wealth resting in his hands, Charlie faced a choice that no child should ever have to make, a choice that would shape not only that Christmas night, but everything that followed after. For a long moment, Charlie stood quite still in the dim light of the garret, the rain whispering steadily above him, his fingers trembling slightly as they held the damp notes, his mind struggling to understand how such a thing could have found its way into his hands on a day when even a penny had seemed hard won. And yet there it was, enough money to banish hunger, to warm the room, to change everything, at least for a while. His mother was the first to speak, her voice low and tired, asking quietly what it was he had found, and when he told them, laying the notes carefully on the small wooden table, as though they might vanish if handled too roughly, the silence that followed was heavier than any word, filled with unspoken thoughts of food, of warmth, of medicine, and of a Christmas that might still be saved. Charlie looked from one pale face to the other, feeling the pull of need tug sharply at his heart, and in his innocence he asked whether it would truly be wrong to use just a little of it, only enough to ease their suffering for the night, only enough to buy bread that was more than a crust, telling himself that whoever had lost it would surely offer a reward, and that it would all come right in the end. But his father, weakened though he was, raised himself slightly and answered with quiet firmness, reminding Charlie of the lessons they had taught him even in better days, that honesty was the one thing poverty could not take away unless a person surrendered it willingly, and that the money must be returned, whatever the cost, for their hardship would not be eased by a wrong that weighed on the soul. Charlie did not argue, for he knew in his heart what the answer would be even before he had asked, and though tears stood in his eyes, he wrapped the notes once more in the scrap of paper and tucked them safely inside his jacket, preparing to go back out into the rain and darkness to the police station. Despite his exhaustion, despite the cold that had settled deep into his bones, the streets were quieter now as he walked, the noise of the day softened by distance and weather, lamps glowing faintly through the mist. And when he reached the station and told his story to the inspector on duty, he spoke simply, without drama, as though honesty itself required no embellishment. Not long after Charlie had left, a well-dressed gentleman arrived to report the loss of £30 in notes, and when the inspector described what had been found, relief spread quickly across the man's face, for the money was important to him, though perhaps not in the way it would have been to a child from a garret, and satisfied that it was safe, he decided to fetch it another day, promising that the boy who had returned it would not go unrewarded. Christmas Day dawned grey and wet, and for the Wenmouths it brought no feast, no celebration, only the quiet endurance of another day passed together, sharing a small loaf and a little milk, grateful at least for the knowledge that they had done what they believed to be right. And as the hours crept by, Charlie sat by the narrow window watching the rain trace endless paths down the glass, listening to its steady rhythm until even hunger grew dull and distant. That night, as he lay once more on his straw pillow, his mother softly repeated words from a Christmas hymn she remembered from long ago, and though the room was cold and bare, there was a gentleness in her voice that wrapped around them like a thin but comforting blanket, and they fell asleep with quiet prayers in their hearts, unaware of what the next day would bring. And when the morning after Christmas arrived, and Charlie, stiff and weary, set about mending his shoes, so that he might go out once more to earn what little he could, a knock sounded at the door, light but distinct, and when he called for the visitor to enter, a stranger stepped into the garret, his fine coat and polished boots looking strangely out of place against the peeling walls and scattered rags. Charlie recognized him at once as the gentleman who had lost the notes, though he had never seen him before, and as the man looked around the room, his expression changed from polite curiosity to something deeper and more troubled, as the reality of the boy's life unfolded before his eyes. Here the story pauses again, gently at the threshold of change, not yet resolved, not yet complete, waiting for you to decide when we move on. The gentleman remained standing for a moment near the doorway, as though uncertain whether he had truly stepped into the right place, his eyes moving slowly over the low ceiling, the damp-stained walls, the narrow bed of rags, and the thin figures of the parents sitting quietly beside it. And only when Charlie spoke again, offering him the small stool that served as their only chair, did the man seem to gather himself and step fully into the room. He took the notes from Charlie's hands, examining them carefully, though it was clear he already knew them well, and then, almost absent-mindedly, he asked the boy a few gentle questions: where he lived, how he came to find the money, what sort of work he did, and with each simple answer Charlie gave, the man's manner softened, his voice losing its business-like tone and becoming slower, more thoughtful, as the story of the Wenmouths unfolded naturally, without complaint or bitterness, just as a plain account of how things were. When he asked what they had eaten on Christmas Day, and Charlie answered honestly that it had been no more than a crust of bread and a cup of milk, the gentleman turned away for a moment, staring at the small darkened window, as though the grey light beyond it might hide the sudden weight of his feelings. And when he spoke again, there was a note of self-reproach in his voice, wondering aloud why he had not come the night before, why he had delayed something that would have cost him so little and meant so much to others. Reaching into his pocket, he placed a gold coin into Charlie's hand, closing the boy's fingers gently around it, and explaining, almost hastily, that it was not a reward for returning the money, but something he owed the family, something long overdue, urging him to go out at once and buy whatever was needed, good food, warmth, medicine, without counting the cost. For there were debts, he said, that could not be measured in accounts alone. Charlie hesitated, glancing instinctively toward his mother, who nodded faintly, tears standing quietly in her eyes. And then he went, heart pounding, down the stairs and into the street, the weight of the coin feeling unreal in his pocket. The city around him suddenly changed, not warmer yet, not kinder, but filled with possibility in a way it had never been before. What followed was not a sudden transformation, not a miracle that erased hardship overnight, but the slow, careful rebuilding of a life, guided by the banker's continued interest and support, by better food that restored strength, by proper care that eased suffering, and by opportunities that came one at a time, each one earned and cherished, until the small shop was opened again, and dignity, long absent, quietly returned with it. Charlie himself grew older under this steady influence, learning, working, proving himself again and again, until the boy who once swept crossings and watched gutters became a trusted figure in the very world of money that had once seemed so distant and unreachable, his rise marked not by ambition alone, but by the same honesty that had guided him on that cold Christmas Eve. Yet even as his life changed, the memory of that garret never left him, nor did the knowledge that for countless others, Christmas still came as a day of hunger and cold, an enforced pause in labour with no relief in sight. And as we think of Victorian Christmases now, wrapped so often in warmth and nostalgia, it is worth remembering those quiet rooms above the streets, where survival itself was the only celebration. And so the story continues to linger, not as a neat ending, but as a gentle reminder drifting softly into the night, asking us, without urgency or demand, whether kindness given quietly, at the right moment, might still have the power to change a life, even in ways we may never fully see. For a short while, the gentleman remained near the threshold of the garret, as though the scene before him did not quite align with what he had expected to find, his gaze moving slowly from the damp streaked ceiling to the narrow bed of rags, and finally resting on the quiet figures of the parents, whose weariness needed no explanation, for it was written plainly in their stillness. Charlie, sensing the unease, stepped forward and placed the folded notes into the man's hand, watching closely as he examined them, not with suspicion but with recognition, and as he listened to the boy describe how they had been found, how they had been returned without delay, the man's questions softened, becoming less those of a banker and more those of a fellow human being trying to understand a life far removed from his own. When he asked, almost casually, what Christmas Day had brought them in the way of food, and Charlie answered that there had been nothing more than a small loaf and a little milk. The man fell silent, his eyes drifting once more to the window, and in that pause there lay the unspoken realization of how narrow the distance could be between comfort and misery, even within the same city. He reached into his coat and drew out a single gold piece, pressing it gently into Charlie's palm and closing the boy's fingers around it before he could refuse, explaining quietly that this was not payment, not a reward, but a debt long owed, urging him to spend it freely, to buy what was needed without hesitation. For hunger, he said, should never be the price of honesty. Charlie stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to receive such a gift, until his mother gave a faint nod of assent, and then he slipped past the visitor and hurried down into the street, the cold air rushing past him as though the world itself had shifted slightly on its axis, not transformed, not softened yet, but opened, just enough to let hope through. What followed was not a sudden change, not a storybook miracle, but the gradual easing of hardship, the slow return of strength through proper food and care, the reopening of the small shop when health allowed, and the careful stitching together of a life that had once seemed irreparably torn, each improvement modest, each one deeply felt. As Charlie grew, he carried with him the lessons learned in the streets, the patience, the watchfulness, the instinct to endure, and when opportunity came, He met it not with arrogance, but with diligence, rising step by step into a world that had once brushed past him without seeing him at all, never forgetting the narrow attic where his life had been shaped. And yet, beyond this single household, beyond this single fortunate turn, the city remained full of others for whom Christmas still meant an empty table and a cold room, and as the rain continued to fall softly over London, it carried with it the quiet truth that celebration and suffering often walk side by side, separated by nothing more than a door, a stairway, or a moment of attention. The story then does not truly end here, but lingers gently, like the echo of footsteps fading down a wet street, inviting us to listen, to remember, and perhaps, when the moment comes, to notice someone standing quietly at the edge of our own crossing. The visitor did not remain long after that, yet his presence lingered in the little room even after the door had closed behind him, as though something unseen had been set gently in motion, and for a while the Wenmouths sat without speaking, listening to the familiar sounds of the buildings settling around them, the rain tapping softly above, the city breathing somewhere below. Charlie moved quietly about the garret, unsure what to do with his hands now that they were no longer clenched in worry, and though nothing around him had changed in appearance, the low ceiling still stained, the walls still bare, the bed still nothing more than rags and shavings, there was a subtle shift in the air, a sense that the long strain of fear had loosened its grip, if only a little. His parents watched him with an expression that held both relief and humility, for they knew that what had come to them was not luck alone, but the fruit of a choice made in the hardest moment, and as they spoke quietly together, they did not talk of riches or comfort, but of thankfulness, of rest, and of the simple hope that tomorrow might be faced with a little more strength than yesterday. Outside, Christmas faded back into ordinary winter, the enforced stillness lifting as the city slowly resumed its restless rhythm, and Charlie returned to the streets once more, not driven now by desperation alone, but by habit and purpose, for work, however small, was still necessary, and dignity, once regained, was something he guarded carefully. Days passed, then weeks, and with them came small but meaningful changes, better food that restored colour to tired faces, warmth that reached deeper than the skin, care that eased pain rather than merely endured it, and all of it arrived quietly, without spectacle, like light returning at dawn after a long night. Charlie himself grew steadier, his shoulders less bowed, his steps more assured, yet he never lost the careful watchfulness learned in hunger, nor the memory of how easily a person could slip from view, and when he later found himself in cleaner rooms and better clothes, he carried with him the echo of wet streets and cold crossings, a reminder of who he had been and why honesty mattered even when no one seemed to be watching. And still, beyond his own story, the city remained full of attics like the one he had known, rooms where families waited out winter with little more than patience and faith, where Christmas arrived not as a feast but as a long day to be endured, and it is there in those unseen spaces that this story truly rests, not as a tale of fortune gained, but as a quiet witness to endurance, to integrity, and to the fragile thread of kindness that once in a while binds one life to another. So we let the scene settle gently now, the rain softening, the city dimming, the memory of a boy standing at a crossing fading slowly into the night, still present, still breathing, waiting until you are ready to continue. As the days slipped quietly into one another, Charlie noticed how differently the city sounded when hunger no longer drowned out every other sensation. The rumble of carts, the distant calls of vendors, the measured footsteps on wet stone all returning as separate, recognizable sounds, rather than one dull roar pressing against his thoughts. And this small change alone made the world feel wider, less threatening, as though he had been allowed to lift his head at last. He still rose early, for habit was not easily shed, and he still worked wherever work could be found, opening doors, carrying parcels, making himself useful in ways that had once barely kept him alive. Yet now there was something steadier in his movements, a sense that effort might lead somewhere beyond the next meal, even if the path remained unclear. At home, his mother's strength returned little by little, not all at once, but in quiet signs that only those who watch closely ever notice. A steadier hand, a longer breath, the willingness to sit by the small window and let the light rest on her face. While his father, though never fully restored, found comfort in being useful again, keeping accounts, offering advice, feeling once more that he belonged to the living world and not merely to the bed that had held him so long. The attic did not change overnight, nor did their lives become easy, but the fear that had once lived there, crouched in corners and whispered in the dark, loosened its hold, replaced by something gentler, a cautious confidence that tomorrow might be faced without dread, that another winter night could be endured. Charlie carried these changes with him as he walked the streets, observing more than he once had, noticing other boys like himself lingering at crossings, scanning the ground, watching faces for signs of kindness or threat, and he understood them now not as rivals or strangers, but as reflections of a life he had nearly lost. And this understanding settled quietly inside him, shaping him in ways he could not yet name. And as the seasons moved on, the memory of that Christmas did not fade, but softened, becoming less a moment of crisis and more a point of quiet turning, a reminder that a single choice, made in silence and unseen by the world, could alter the course of a life without fanfare or announcement, simply by remaining true to what one had been taught when times were better. Beyond Charlie's own path, London continued much as it always had, full of contrast and contradiction, warmth and misery existing side by side, and while some tables were laid with care and plenty, others remained bare, their occupants enduring the long hours of winter with nothing but patience and resolve. And it is there, in those unseen rooms and unremarked lives, that this story continues to breathe, waiting, unhurried, for the next moment to unfold. In time, Charlie came to understand that what had happened that Christmas was not something that announced itself loudly, nor something that could be easily pointed to and named, but rather a quiet shift, like the slow turning of a tide that alters the shoreline without ever being seen in motion. And this awareness stayed with him as he moved through the days, shaping his thoughts in subtle ways. He noticed how easily people passed one another in the streets, without truly seeing, how a face bent slightly downward or a coat worn thin could render a person invisible, and he remembered how often he himself had stood just outside the edges of attention, present yet unacknowledged, learning patience not as a virtue but as a necessity. At home the garret remained small and spare, yet it no longer felt quite so airless, for the knowledge that tomorrow might be met without fear softened even the hardest surfaces. And in the evenings, when the city quieted and the lamps glimmered faintly below, Charlie would sit close to his parents and listen as his mother spoke of earlier years, of ordinary days that had once seemed unremarkable, and which now returned gently through memory, bringing with them a sense of continuity that hunger had almost erased. His father, though still limited in body, found a renewed steadiness in routine, keeping careful note of small matters, offering what guidance he could, and taking comfort in watching his son grow not only stronger, but more assured, as though the weight that had once pressed so heavily upon the child's shoulders had begun, at last, to ease. Charlie himself carried forward what the streets had taught him: the habit of observation, the instinct to endure, the quiet resolve to do what was right, even when no one was watching. And as opportunities came, slowly and without ceremony, he met them with the same calm persistence that had once guided him through rain-soaked crossings and long, hungry days. Yet, even as his own life steadied, he did not forget the countless others whose winters remained unbroken by kindness, whose Christmases passed in cold rooms and empty hours, and this awareness stayed with him, not as a burden but as a quiet companion, reminding him that comfort was never guaranteed, and that dignity, once recognized, ought to be protected wherever it appeared. And so the story drifts onward, not toward a conclusion, but deeper into reflection, lingering in the half-light between hardship and hope, where lives are shaped not by grand gestures, but by small, unseen choices made in silence, choices that ripple outward long after the moment itself has passed, waiting now, patiently, for whatever comes next. As winter deepened and the days shortened further, Charlie became aware of how darkness arrived earlier each afternoon, not abruptly, but by degrees, slipping softly between buildings and settling into corners where the light rarely reached. And in this gradual fading he found a strange familiarity, for it mirrored the way hardship had once crept into their lives, unnoticed at first, then all-encompassing. He walked the streets with a quieter confidence, now not because he believed himself safe from misfortune, but because he understood it better, having lived close to its edge, and this understanding gave him patience, a steadiness that did not demand quick rewards or sudden change, only the assurance that effort, honestly given, was never entirely wasted. In the evenings, when work was done and the city's noise softened into a distant murmur, Charlie often returned to the garret carrying small, ordinary things: a loaf wrapped in paper, a bit of coal, sometimes nothing at all but his own presence, and each time he climbed the narrow stairs, he felt again the weight of how easily such simple acts might once have been impossible. His mother would sit quietly, her strength returning not in dramatic leaps, but in moments that almost went unnoticed, a longer stretch without resting, a steadier voice, the ability to smile without effort, while his father listened and nodded, offering small observations, reminders that even reduced circumstances did not erase a person's place in the world. There were nights when the rain returned, tapping softly at the roof as it had on that Christmas Eve, and when it did, Charlie would lie awake for a while on his straw mattress, listening to its rhythm, remembering how the sound had once carried fear with it, and noticing how different it felt now, familiar rather than threatening, like a voice repeating something already understood. He thought often of the money he had found, not as wealth, but as a moment of choice, and he came to see that what had truly mattered was not what the notes could buy, but what refusing to use them had preserved, a sense of self that could not be taken, no matter how poor the circumstances became. Beyond the walls of their room, the city continued its endless movement, filled with lives brushing past one another, some rising, some falling, many remaining unseen, and it was there, among those quiet intersections of chance and endurance, that Charlie's story continued to unfold, not marked by dates or grand announcements, but by the steady accumulation of days lived with care. And so we remain with him still, walking beside him through the softened darkness, listening to the measured sound of footsteps on stone, allowing the night to stretch gently onward, without urgency, without an ending, simply carrying us forward, one calm moment at a time. As winter tightened its quiet hold over the city, Charlie became aware of how the light withdrew earlier each day, not suddenly, but in small, almost imperceptible steps, slipping away between rooftops and alleyways, until London seemed to settle into dusk long before evening had truly arrived. And in that gradual dimming he recognized something familiar, for hardship had entered their lives in much the same way, gently at first, then completely. He moved through the streets now with a steadier pace, not because he believed himself protected from misfortune, but because he had learned how closely it followed the unwary, and this knowledge gave him a calm patience, a willingness to work without expecting immediate reward, trusting that effort, honestly given, carried its own quiet weight. In the evenings, when the sounds of carts and voices softened and the city drew inward, Charlie climbed the narrow stairs back to the garret, sometimes carrying a loaf wrapped in paper, sometimes a small bundle of coal, and sometimes nothing at all, except the comfort of having endured another day, each step reminding him how easily such ordinary acts had once been beyond reach. His mother's strength returned slowly, so gradually that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not watching closely, showing itself in the way she could sit longer by the small window, in the steadiness of her hands, in a voice that no longer trembled with exhaustion, while his father, though never fully restored, found purpose again in small responsibilities, offering guidance, keeping accounts, and reclaiming a sense of place in the world. There were nights when the rain came back, striking the roof with the same soft persistence it had shown on Christmas Eve, and on those nights Charlie would lie awake for a time, listening to the rhythm, aware of how differently it sounded now, no longer carrying fear, but a sense of continuity, as though it were repeating something he had already survived. He thought often of the money he had found, not as wealth, but as a moment suspended in time, a quiet test that had revealed something about who he was and who he hoped to become. And he understood that what mattered most was not what had been gained, but what had been preserved when temptation had been strongest. Beyond the walls of their small room, London continued to move endlessly, full of lives passing close without ever touching, some rising, some falling, many remaining unseen. And it is there, in those unnoticed spaces, that Charlie's story continues to unfold, unhurried, unresolved, and gently carried forward into the waiting night. As the weeks passed and winter settled more firmly into the city's bones, Charlie grew increasingly aware of how time itself seemed to move differently when life was no longer reduced to the single question of survival, for the hours no longer pressed upon him with the same urgency, and even the cold felt less hostile when it was no longer accompanied by constant fear. He noticed how the streets appeared altered by this shift, not because they had changed, but because he had, the same wet stones and shadowed doorways, now holding details he had once been too anxious to observe, the faint glow of lamps reflected in puddles, the echo of footsteps fading into distance, the quiet persistence of people carrying on with lives both heavier and lighter than his own. At home, the small room slowly took on the rhythm of ordinary days. Not comfortable, not warm by any generous measure, but steadier, and in that steadiness there was relief, for his parents no longer lay listening for the worst, but spoke instead of small plans, of what might be done next, of what could be managed if strength continued to return. Charlie listened more than he spoke, absorbing these moments, aware that such conversations had once seemed impossible. And when he went out again each morning, he carried with him not only the habits learned through hardship, but a quiet attentiveness, a sense that life could be shaped gently, through consistency rather than force. There were moments when memory returned unexpectedly, the image of a crossing slick with rain, the weight of a broom in numb hands, the sound of water filling a broken shoe, and these recollections surfaced without pain now, settling instead like reminders of a path already walked, one that had taught him endurance without bitterness. He understood, perhaps without fully forming the thought, that his life would never entirely shed these early lessons, and that even if comfort came later, it would rest upon foundations laid during nights of hunger and days of unrecognized labor, and this understanding grounded him, keeping his expectations modest and his gratitude quiet. Beyond the narrow boundaries of his own experience, the city continued to hold countless similar stories, unfolding unseen in attics, cellars and narrow rooms tucked above shops and courts, where winter pressed close and Christmas passed like any other day. And it was among these unspoken lives that Charlie's own story continued to move, not toward an ending but onward, gently into whatever waited next. As winter held its quiet dominion over London, Charlie began to sense how endurance itself could become a kind of rhythm, something learned and practiced until it no longer felt sharp or urgent, but steady, like breathing. And in this rhythm his days found their shape, neither easy nor overwhelming, simply continuing, one after another. He moved through the city with a careful awareness, noticing how small choices accumulated over time, how a word spoken kindly, a task done thoroughly, or a moment of patience could ease a day that might otherwise have slipped into weariness. And this understanding settled within him without ceremony, becoming part of how he met the world. The garret remained unchanged in its simplicity, yet it was no longer a place of constant waiting, for his parents now filled the hours with quiet purpose, his mother folding and mending, his father keeping watch over small details, and in these ordinary actions there was a dignity that hardship had not been able to erase. Evenings passed softly, marked by the low glow of a lamp and the distant murmur of the city below, and Charlie often sat listening rather than speaking, content to let the day recede, aware that rest itself was a gift when worry no longer ruled every thought. From time to time he thought of others he passed in the streets, boys like himself, faces turned downward, steps hurried, lives pressed small by necessity, and these thoughts stirred in him not fear but a quiet recognition, a sense of shared experience that asked for neither pity nor judgment. He did not imagine his path as exceptional, nor did he expect fortune to arrive again unannounced, but he carried forward with the calm knowledge that what had sustained him once could sustain him again if needed, and that honesty, practiced quietly, remained its own form of shelter. And so the story continues to unfold without urgency, lingering in the spaces between effort and rest, between memory and hope, moving gently onward through the long winter nights, waiting patiently, as all lives do, for whatever the next morning chooses to bring. As the winter night stretched longer and the city settled earlier into silence, Charlie learned to listen to the small signs of steadiness that had returned to his life. The even sound of his parents breathing as they slept, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, the quiet reassurance that another day had been lived and survived without crisis. Morning no longer arrived with the same sharp edge of dread, and though work was still uncertain and comfort modest, there was a growing sense that effort belonged to a wider purpose than simple endurance, that each day carried with it the possibility of being shaped gently, rather than merely endured. When Charlie walked the streets, he noticed how many lives unfolded alongside his own, unnoticed and unrecorded. Men and women moving with bowed heads and practiced resolve, children learning too early the habits of caution and patience. And he understood, perhaps more deeply than before, that his story was not singular, but one thread among many woven quietly through the fabric of the city. At home the hours passed with a calm that once would have seemed impossible, his mother resting without fear of immediate want, his father offering words of guidance that carried weight again, and Charlie himself finding a certain peace in small routines, in returning each evening knowing that what little he brought mattered. The memory of Christmas did not fade, but softened, becoming less a moment of suffering, and more a quiet marker in time, a reminder that hardship had been met without surrender, that integrity had held firm even when circumstances urged otherwise, and that this, more than any sudden change, had altered the course of his life. Outside, London continued as it always had, its contrasts unbroken, its wealth and want existing side by side, and somewhere above its streets, in rooms like the one Charlie called home, countless others still waited out the winter with patience and restraint, unseen yet enduring. And so the night settles again around the story, unclosed and unhurried, carrying with it the steady rhythm of footsteps, the distant echo of rain, and the quiet presence of a boy who learned, long before his time, how much strength could be found in choosing rightly, even when no one else was watching. As the season wore on, and winter settled fully into its long routine, Charlie came to feel that life no longer pressed against him with the same sharp insistence as before. For even though hardship had not vanished, it had softened into something more manageable, something that could be carried without fear overtaking every thought. The nights passed quietly now, marked not by worry but by familiar sounds, the faint murmur of the city far below, the gentle movement of air through cracked boards, the slow rhythm of sleep returning to a room that had once known too much wakefulness. And in these moments Charlie sensed how profoundly rest itself could heal. Each morning when he stepped back into the streets, he did so with a calm attentiveness, noticing details he had once overlooked, the way light fell unevenly across wet stone, the pause before a door opened, the expressions of people moving through their own unseen burdens, and he understood that survival was not only a matter of strength, but of awareness. Within the garret, his parents reclaimed small pieces of ordinary life, his mother finding comfort in simple tasks done at her own pace, his father offering quiet counsel and observation, and though their circumstances remained modest, there was dignity in the way they met each day without despair. Charlie carried forward the memory of the crossing, the rain, the choice he had made, not as something heavy, but as a steady guide, a reminder that character was shaped not in moments of ease, but in silence, when no one was present to witness a decision except oneself. He no longer measured his days by hunger alone, but by effort honestly given, and by the knowledge that even the smallest kindness, whether offered or received, could alter the weight of a life in ways that were not immediately visible. Beyond his own quiet progress, London continued endlessly, full of hidden rooms and unspoken stories, of children learning too early what endurance meant, and it was among these countless unseen lives that Charlie's own path continued to unfold, gently and without spectacle, moving forward through the long winter nights, unhurried, unresolved, and waiting patiently for what would come next. As the cold months carried on, Charlie discovered that steadiness had a sound of its own, quieter than hardship, softer than fear, a sound made up of ordinary moments repeating themselves without disruption. The creak of stairs beneath careful steps, the rustle of cloth being folded, the calm certainty that the night would pass as it had the one before. He began to sense that life, when stripped of constant alarm, revealed details that had always been there but rarely noticed. The way breath settled naturally into an even rhythm, the way silence could feel companionable rather than empty, and how effort, when no longer driven by panic, could become almost meditative. When he walked through the streets, he no longer hurried unless he needed to, his gaze lifting more often now, not in expectation of charity, but in simple awareness, seeing the city as a place made up of countless small lives moving side by side, each carrying its own measure of burden and resilience. The room above the street remained plain and narrow, yet it held a gentler presence than before, shaped not by possessions but by the absence of immediate fear, and his parents moved within it with a renewed quiet purpose, neither hopeful nor hopeless, but grounded in the simple fact of having endured. Charlie often reflected, without fully putting it into words, on how a single evening, one decision made in silence, had altered the direction of his days, not by removing hardship altogether, but by teaching him that integrity could serve as a kind of anchor, holding a life steady even when circumstances shifted unpredictably. He understood now that comfort was never guaranteed, but neither was despair inevitable, and that between the two lay a wide, patient space where effort, honesty, and time could slowly do their work. And so the story continues onward, carried gently through the long nights of winter, unannounced and unresolved, resting in the quiet certainty that life, when met with care, has a way of moving forward one calm moment at a time. As the winter days followed one another with quiet regularity, Charlie began to feel how persistence itself could shape a life, not through sudden turns or dramatic change, but through the steady repetition of small, careful acts, each one building gently upon the last, until even hardship lost some of its power to overwhelm. The city no longer felt quite so vast or indifferent as he moved through it, for he had learned its rhythms, the hours when streets were busiest, the moments when they grew still, the subtle signs that told him when to wait and when to move on, and this familiarity brought with it a sense of belonging that hunger alone had once denied him. Back in the narrow room above the street, the atmosphere continued to soften, shaped not by comfort, but by reassurance. His parents speaking more often of ordinary things, of the passing weather, of small plans that reached no further than the next day, yet carried with them the quiet promise of continuity. Charlie listened closely, absorbing these conversations as he once absorbed the sounds of rain and traffic, aware that such ordinary exchanges were themselves a form of wealth, fragile and easily lost, yet deeply sustaining when allowed to take root. He carried the memory of his earlier struggles without bitterness, understanding now that they had taught him patience, attentiveness, and restraint, qualities that rarely announce themselves, yet quietly guide a person through uncertain ground. And beyond his own experience, the city remained filled with countless unseen stories, unfolding silently in rooms much like his own, lives shaped by the same cold, the same narrow chances. And it was there, among these parallel paths, that Charlie's story continued to move, not toward an ending, but onward, gently and without haste, as the long winter nights slowly gave way to whatever waited beyond them. As winter progressed with its unbroken calm, Charlie began to sense that life was no longer something that happened only at the edge of exhaustion, but something that could unfold slowly, one measured moment after another, shaped not by sudden relief, but by the simple fact that each day no longer threatened to collapse into the next. He noticed how familiarity softened even the hardest surroundings, how the streets he once crossed with fear now felt predictable, almost companionable, their sounds and movements settling into patterns he could follow without strain, and this quiet familiarity gave him a sense of footing he had not known before. Within the small room above the street, time passed differently now, marked by modest routines rather than anxious waiting. His mother moving gently through her tasks, his father offering thoughts and observations that carried the calm weight of experience, and Charlie himself finding reassurance in the ordinariness of it all, in the knowledge that nothing needed to be solved all at once. There were evenings when he sat quietly, listening to the city's distant murmur rise and fall like breath, and in those moments he understood that safety was not always loud or obvious, but often revealed itself in silence, in the absence of urgent fear, in the steady continuation of life without interruption. The memory of that Christmas remained with him, not as a sharp point of pain but as a softened image, a reminder of how easily life could narrow, and how a single act, made without witness or reward, could quietly widen it again, altering the course of days yet to come. He did not imagine his future clearly, nor did he expect certainty to replace effort, but he carried forward with a grounded patience, trusting that time, when met with care and integrity, could be allowed to do its slow work. And beyond his own quiet steadiness, London continued to hold countless lives much like his once had been, unfolding unnoticed behind walls and windows, enduring the same winter with the same restraint. And it is there, among those unseen hours and unrecorded choices, that this story continues to rest, moving gently onward, unhurried, unresolved, and waiting. As the winter carried on in its quiet persistence, Charlie began to feel how days could stack themselves gently, one upon another, without demanding constant vigilance. And this accumulation of ordinary hours brought with it a subtle reassurance, as though life itself had slowed to match his breathing. He found that even uncertainty felt different now, no longer sharp or overwhelming, but distant and manageable, something that could be acknowledged without fear. And this shift allowed him to move through his days with a calmer presence, attentive rather than anxious, steady rather than strained. The streets continued to teach him, not through hardship alone, but through repetition, through the simple act of being there each day, observing how people moved, how they carried their burdens quietly, how kindness appeared not as spectacle but as brief, unremarkable gestures that nevertheless altered the weight of an afternoon. In the small room above the street, life unfolded in similarly modest ways, his parents finding comfort in routine, in conversation that did not circle endlessly around worry, in moments of shared silence that no longer felt empty, and Charlie sensed that these ordinary rhythms were doing more to restore them than any sudden change ever could. At times he reflected on how narrow the margin between despair and endurance had once been, and how easily he might have stepped across it. Yet he did not dwell there long, for the lesson had already been learned, settling quietly within him as a guide rather than a warning. He understood now that survival was not a single victory, but a series of small decisions made consistently, often without acknowledgement, and that dignity was preserved not through recognition, but through adherence to what felt right even when circumstances pressed hard in the opposite direction. And so the story continues, moving forward with the same calm resolve that now shaped Charlie's days, carried gently through the long winter nights, unmarked by finality, resting instead in the quiet assurance that life, when met patiently, unfolds in its own time. By the time the last stretch of winter arrived, the city had grown quieter, its edges softened by mist and habit, and Charlie moved through it with the kind of ease that comes only after long familiarity. The sharpness of survival had dulled into something slower and more deliberate, an acceptance that work, rest, and uncertainty would always exist side by side, like the rhythm of footsteps echoing faintly along the cobblestones. He no longer felt the same hunger for change that had once burned so fiercely inside him. What he wanted now was steadiness, the quiet strength to meet each day as it came. There was comfort in repetition, in sweeping a small step clean, in running errands through familiar streets, in returning to the narrow room each evening and finding his parents waiting, their faces calm, their words ordinary and unhurried. The garret, though still poor and dimly lit, had become a place of refuge rather than fear. Its walls held the soft marks of living, the faint outline of hands that had patched them, the smell of bread warming near the fire, the muted hum of life continuing in its modest way. Charlie sometimes sat by the window in silence, watching the lamps flare and dim across the wet street, and in those moments he felt something close to peace. Not joy exactly, but a gentle completeness. He often thought about how the smallest moments had carried him the farthest. The choice to be honest, the patience to endure, the decision to keep walking even when there was no promise of reward, and he realized that this, not luck or rescue, was what had truly changed him. The winter would end, as all winters do, and another would come after it. But Charlie knew now that endurance had its own kind of warmth, the quiet fire of persistence that keeps a soul upright when the world grows cold. And so the story goes on, without hurry, without ending, drifting through the soft light of morning that follows a long night, carrying the quiet truth that survival, once learned, never really leaves you. By the time the final weeks of winter unfolded, London seemed to move through a slower rhythm, the air damp and heavy, the light diffused through a thin veil of smoke and frost. Charlie had learned the city's sounds as though they were a language. The soft hum of carriage wheels over wet stone, the occasional clatter of a door being closed somewhere far below, the quiet exchanges between people who passed one another without looking up. It was no longer an overwhelming place to him, but something steady and predictable, a vast organism breathing faintly through fog and time. He had grown older in ways not easily measured by years, his hands calloused but sure, his steps no longer hurried, his gaze level and patient. There was a sense of groundedness in him now, as though hardship had carved out a quiet space inside that could no longer be taken. He worked with care, earning modest pay but earning it with dignity, and each evening when he returned home, he felt a slow, deliberate gratitude that had nothing to do with riches. It was the gratitude of survival, of having made it through one more day without falling back into the abyss he had once known too well. The garret had changed too, though to a stranger it might have looked almost the same. The roof still leaked in certain corners when the rain came hard, and the air still carried the faint scent of cold stone. But there was warmth now, a low, persistent warmth from a small stove that rarely went out. His mother hummed softly while she worked, her health fragile but holding, her movements slow yet certain, while his father, though still bent and thin, kept the household in order with a quiet pride. Between them there was no longer the constant hush of worry, but an unspoken understanding that they had crossed a great distance together, not in miles but in endurance. Sometimes, on still evenings, Charlie would open the small window and let the city's breath drift in, a mix of coal smoke, damp air, and the faraway sound of bells marking the hour. He would sit there without speaking, his elbows resting on the sill, and think of how easily life could shift, how close despair had once been, how one honest act had pulled him, inch by inch, into a different future. He did not see himself as fortunate, nor as chosen, but simply as someone who had been tested, and found his own small measure of courage. He thought often of others who still walked the same streets he once had, boys his age scouring the gutters for scraps of food or bits of leather, their eyes wary, their hands quick, their lives balanced on the same fragile edge. Sometimes he gave them what little he could, a coin, a crust, a word of warning, but more often he gave what could not be measured, the silent understanding of someone who knew exactly how it felt to be invisible. As the months went by, and the frost began to loosen its hold on the city. The streets filled once more with the pale signs of spring. The smell of thawing earth, the drip of water from eaves, the faint brightness of morning light touching wet stone. London's rhythm changed again, as it always did, yet Charlie moved through it unchanged in spirit, guided by the same patience that had carried him through the winter. He no longer wished for a grand turning point or a sudden transformation. What he desired was something far simpler, the quiet continuity of a life lived honestly, the slow unfolding of days that belonged fully to him. And though no one watching from the street would have thought much of the thin, dark-haired boy with steady hands and calm eyes, there was something within him now that no poverty could ever erase, the quiet certainty that he had faced the hardest of winters and remained unbroken. And so the story does not end. It lingers, as all real stories do, somewhere between the memory of hardship and the promise of peace. The rain continues to fall lightly across the city's rooftops. The lamps burn faintly in the mist, and Charlie walks onward through the softened light of morning, not seeking miracles anymore, but carrying the kind of strength that grows only in silence, in perseverance, and in the long, patient waiting of the soul. When the first hints of spring reached the city, they came without ceremony, not through sunshine or song, but through a faint easing of the air, a gentler dampness, a smell of thawing stone and soot mingling with distant river mist. Charlie felt it before he saw it, in the way the mornings no longer bit quite so sharply against his skin, and in how the light lingered a little longer each evening as he walked home through the maze of narrow streets. After the long stillness of winter, even these small shifts felt like a promise. The markets began to stir again with colour, baskets of early vegetables laid out on wooden tables, sheets of cloth unrolled for trade, the low hum of bargaining returning to the rhythm of the streets. Charlie moved through this world with quiet familiarity, carrying parcels, running errands, sweeping the steps of shops he had once passed in silence. He was no longer the boy who hurried with downcast eyes, but someone who walked with the slow assurance of belonging, even if only in the modest corners of the city. At home, the changes were just as subtle. His mother began to hum while she worked, a soft sound that filled the garret like sunlight spilling through cracks in the ceiling. She had taken to keeping a small clay pot of herbs on the windowsill, a bit of green that somehow survived the smoke and cold. His father, though still frail, had found new purpose helping a nearby tailor with bookkeeping, the careful order of numbers giving him something to claim as his own. The house that had once echoed with quiet despair now carried the rhythm of ordinary life. The sound of scissors through cloth, the clink of a teacup, the creak of the floor when someone crossed from one side of the room to the other. Charlie often sat by the window during these evenings, not out of restlessness but contentment, watching the pale light fade from the rooftops and the lamps bloom into life one by one below. Sometimes he thought of that night on the crossing, the rain, the broom, the single coin that had felt so impossibly precious, and he felt an ache that was neither sorrow nor pride, but a kind of reverence for what endurance had taught him. He had come to understand that life did not always reward virtue, nor punish struggle, but it remembered both, quietly, faithfully, and that the choices made in obscurity often shaped the course of everything that followed. It was not fortune that had carried him forward, nor mercy, but the simple, stubborn act of remaining kind and honest even when no one noticed. Now, as the air softened and the days stretched longer, Charlie began to dream of small things, of learning a trade that would last, of perhaps one day having a small place of his own, of being able to provide for his parents as they had once tried to provide for him. He did not dream of wealth or ease, but of steadiness, the quiet, reliable kind of life that hunger had taught him to cherish above all else. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he imagined the city not as a tangle of hardship and noise, but as a vast, breathing thing, flawed, weary, yet endlessly alive, and within it, thousands of lives like his, each one turning slowly, quietly, toward its own small measure of light. And so the story lingers there for now, in the faint breath of spring that moves through the streets of Victorian London, where smoke and sunlight mix in equal measure, and where a boy named Charlie, who once fought the long cold of a forgotten attic, walks onward beneath a gentler sky, carrying with him the quiet strength of having survived. By the time the fog lifted and the first true days of spring arrived, London seemed to stretch and yawn after its long sleep. The Thames rolled slow and brown under a softer light, carriages splashed through puddles that no longer froze overnight, and market stalls spilled back into the streets, their awnings bright against the dull brick. The city was waking, not suddenly, but with a deep, weary tenderness, and Charlie moved through it with the quiet composure of someone who had weathered more than one kind of winter. He had found a place sweeping for a bookseller near Fleet Street, a man who traded in second-hand volumes and broadsheets, whose shop smelled of paper and coal dust and the faint sweetness of ink. Charlie worked there 6 days a week, keeping the floor clean, carrying parcels, and sometimes running messages across the city. The work was steady and kind in its own way. It did not bruise the body as street labour had done, and it left the mind free to wander. In the still hours between customers, he would glance at the shelves and imagine the lives stored there, explorers, poets, kings, forgotten soldiers, all captured and waiting patiently between worn covers. Sometimes, when the shop was empty and the light slanted through the window in long dusted rays, the bookseller, a grey-haired man named Mr. Whitby, would read aloud from a paper or an old volume of Dickens. His voice carried through the shop like the steady ticking of a clock, unhurried and warm, and though Charlie rarely understood every word, he listened with a kind of reverence. It was the first time he had ever heard stories spoken not as sermons or warnings, but as music meant simply to be shared. When he returned home in the evenings, he brought with him bits of these stories, fragments of language, stray lines of thought, and repeated them softly to his mother as she prepared supper. She listened as if the words themselves were nourishment, smiling faintly as he spoke, as though the rhythm of those phrases might keep the world from growing harsh again. His father, too, listened in silence, his hands folded, his eyes half closed, perhaps remembering his own youth, when the future had still seemed pliable and kind. Outside, the season unfolded gently. Laundry fluttered pale and clean along the alleys. Children played in the warmer corners of courtyards, and the river carried the reflection of a sun that finally held warmth again. It was not a city transformed. The rich were still rich, the poor still weary, but it was a city breathing, and for Charlie that was enough. Each day he woke to the sound of footsteps and voices, the call of tradesmen, the turning of wheels, and in all of it he heard not noise, but proof of life continuing. And still, somewhere in his mind, that cold Christmas lived quietly, not as pain but as a compass, a reminder of what mattered and how easily a single choice could divide a life in two. He did not speak of it often. It had become something inward like faith or memory, something carried rather than told. Sometimes, as dusk settled, he would walk along the edge of the river before returning home, watching the lamps flicker one by one along the bridges. The light trembled on the water, rippling and uncertain, yet endlessly renewed. In it, Charlie saw the reflection of his own small existence, fragile perhaps, but bright enough to continue. And so spring deepened into early summer, quietly, naturally, as all seasons do, and Charlie moved with it, no longer chasing fortune, no longer haunted by the past, but simply living within the narrow but precious peace he had built. The city hummed on around him, full of invisible stories like his, and though none of them would ever be written in the ledgers of history, they were, in their quiet endurance, the truest record of what it meant to live. By midsummer, London had shed its grey winter skin. The air, though still thick with smoke, carried warmth. Now, a mellow, golden heat that drifted through open windows and lingered on the narrow streets long after the sun went down. The bells that once tolled faintly through the fog now rang bright and clear across the rooftops, and Charlie often paused to listen, as their sound mingled with the cries of vendors, the laughter of children, and the rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone. He had settled fully into his work at Mr. Whitby's shop, finding in it a balance he had never known before. There was comfort in repetition, in the way dust gathered predictably on the same corners of the floor, in the steady pattern of customers who came each morning to browse and talk, in the scent of paper and ink that greeted him like something familiar and kind. It was not a grand life, but it was a whole one, and for someone who had once lived from hour to hour, that was enough. Mr. Whitby had come to depend on him, not only for errands but for company. The old man's eyes, pale and clouded with age, could no longer read for long, so Charlie read aloud now, slowly, carefully, stumbling at times, but improving each week. He learned words that felt like treasures, sentences that seemed to contain whole worlds, and he began to understand that knowledge itself could be a kind of freedom, a quiet door opening inward. In the evenings, when the shop closed and the streets filled with the hum of life, Charlie sometimes walked along the Strand, watching the lamplighters move from post to post. Their torches flared in the gathering dusk, each small flame brightening the path ahead, and as he watched, he felt the same quiet wonder that had filled him as a child when he saw snow fall for the first time. That sense that the world, even in its weariness, could still surprise him with beauty. The city at night was never silent. Even after the shops shuttered and the carriages thinned, there were footsteps, laughter, distant songs from taverns, and the echo of wheels on cobblestone far away. Charlie would walk until his legs grew heavy, then turn homeward through the quieter lanes where the air smelled faintly of soot and bread, the kind of scent that spoke of both survival and comfort. He often thought of his parents then, his father asleep before the fire, his mother mending quietly under the lamplight, and a warmth rose in his chest that had nothing to do with the season. He was no longer a boy merely surviving. He was a young man learning what it meant to live deliberately, to notice the small things, to speak kindly, to take pride in labour that once might have felt beneath him. And though life remained fragile, he carried within him a steadiness that no misfortune could easily undo. The summer stretched on, long days of light and work, quiet evenings filled with the soft chorus of the city breathing around him. Charlie did not think of the future as something distant anymore. It felt instead like a current moving through him, pulling him gently onward, steady and certain. He did not need to know where it led. It was enough simply to follow. And so the story continues, carried forward on warm air and lamplight, through streets that shimmer with heat and memory, through a London that hums quietly with life unseen, where one boy's endurance has become a man's quiet peace, not marked by triumph, but by stillness, by grace, and by the simple, unwavering act of continuing. When autumn returned, it came not with the harshness of the winters he remembered, but softly, almost kindly, the air cool and crisp, the light deepening into amber tones that caught on the windows and made the river shine like old brass. The city began to change its voice again, the market cries lower now, the evenings stretching out sooner, the scent of coal smoke mixing with apples and damp leaves. Charlie noticed these things the way one might notice a friend aging, tenderly, without sadness, only with understanding. His work continued much the same, yet it felt different. Whitby's health had grown frail, his steps slower, his thoughts sometimes scattered like dust over old pages, and Charlie had begun to take on more responsibility in the shop, keeping the accounts, arranging the shelves, and on quiet afternoons, managing the customers himself. He handled these tasks with quiet pride, though he never spoke of it. There was something deeply satisfying about the order of things, the smell of fresh ink, the weight of a ledger balanced cleanly, the sound of the doorbell above the shop tinkling softly as someone entered. One day in late October, a girl came in to buy a book for a younger brother. Her dress was plain, her hands red from work, yet there was a gentleness in her manner that caught Charlie's attention. She spoke softly, choosing her words as if they were fragile things, and when she smiled, shyly, almost apologetically, it seemed to him that the whole shop grew lighter. Her name was Eliza, and she lived not far from the river, in a neighbourhood he knew well from his boyhood, though he did not say so. Their conversation was brief, yet it lingered long after she left, like the echo of a bell that continues long after the sound fades. As the days shortened, she returned a few times, sometimes for another book, sometimes with a message for her employer. Their exchanges were simple: a greeting, a few words about the weather, a laugh that never rose above a whisper. Yet these moments began to fill Charlie's thoughts in a way he did not expect. It was not the restless yearning of youth that stirred in him, but something gentler, the recognition of another life moving quietly alongside his own, shaped by the same patience, the same quiet endurance. The season deepened. The leaves along the Thames turned to dull gold and drifted into the water. The air grew sharper at dusk, and the lamplighters moved through the streets earlier each evening. Charlie found comfort in the returning chill. It reminded him of how far he had come. The cold no longer frightened him as it once had. It was simply another part of the rhythm of things, another reminder that life, like the seasons, could be harsh and still hold beauty within it. On certain evenings, after closing the shop, he would walk the same crossing where he had once swept the streets as a boy. The paving stones were unchanged. The lamps still stood at the corners, but to him it felt like another world. He would pause there for a moment, watching the carriages pass, and think of that child with numb hands and empty pockets, wondering if the boy would even recognize the man he had become. And in those quiet moments, with the city glowing faintly around him, Charlie would smile, not with pride but with gratitude for all the small mercies that had carried him here. The first frost came early that year, a thin white veil spreading across the rooftops, catching in the lamplight like dusted glass. Yet even as the air grew colder, there was warmth waiting in unexpected places, in the steady glow of the shop's window, in the brief smile of a passing stranger, in the knowledge that he was no longer alone against the season. Life had grown neither rich nor easy, but it had become full, and that fullness, quiet and unspoken, was enough. And so the story moves onward again, into the cool stillness of autumn, not ending, not beginning anew, but continuing as life always does, one breath, one step, one flicker of light against the long London dusk. Winter returned as it always did, though this one came slower, gentler than the last. The frost crept along the windows again, tracing its familiar silver patterns, and the river moved sluggishly under the weight of cold mist. London seemed quieter that year, or perhaps it was simply that Charlie had learned to listen differently, to hear stillness where he once heard only noise. The bookshop had changed since autumn. Mr. Whitby had grown weaker with each passing week, his voice thinning until it was no more than a whisper. One morning in late December, before the light had fully reached the street, he passed away in his chair by the fire, a book still open in his hands. Charlie found him there, peaceful, almost smiling, as if he had simply fallen asleep inside one of his own stories. The loss was quiet, but deep. For days afterward the shop felt hollow, every sound too large, every silence too long. Yet grief, like the cold, became something that could be lived with. Charlie kept the doors open, kept the fire lit, dusted the shelves, straightened the books, and little by little the room began to feel alive again. Customers returned, not for novelty but for familiarity, for the comfort of seeing the same light in the window, the same calm young man behind the counter. In this way the shop endured, and so did he. Eliza continued to visit, always with a shy smile, bringing with her the warmth of life beyond the door, stories of her brother, of her long walks by the river, of the quiet hopes she never voiced directly. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, she lingered longer than usual, helping him close the shutters. Their hands brushed over the latch, and for a moment neither moved. There was no need for words. The silence between them was enough. It was a kind of understanding that existed beyond speech. Two lives, both shaped by hardship, meeting gently in the stillness of a shared room. That night, after she left, Charlie stood for a long time by the window, watching the snow drift down through the lamplight. The world looked softer, muffled and white, and the street below, once the place where he had begged, swept and shivered, now lay calm and gleaming under the quiet sky. He thought of his parents, of Mr. Whitby, of the countless faces that had passed him by in those long, hungry years, and he felt not sorrow but an immense tenderness for all of it. for the pain, for the mercy, for the simple fact of having lived through it all. When Christmas came again, the garret was warm. His mother's laughter carried through the room as she prepared the meal. His father, though frail, hummed an old tune by the fire, and Eliza sat beside them, her hands folded in her lap, smiling as Charlie read aloud from one of the books Mr. Whitby had left behind. The words filled the room like candlelight, steady and golden, and for the first time in years he felt that Christmas was not a season of hunger or loss, but of quiet fullness, the kind that needed no feast, no miracle, only gratitude. Outside, the snow kept falling, over the city's rooftops, over the frozen river, over the narrow streets, where children laughed, and where, not so long ago, another child had knelt in the cold and dreamed of warmth. The sound of bells drifted faintly through the air, soft and far away, and Charlie paused in his reading to listen. For a moment everything seemed still, the fire, the snow, the breath of those he loved, and in that stillness he felt the pulse of something greater than all hardship, something that had been there all along. It was not wealth, nor luck, nor even happiness as the world would name it. It was simply peace. And so the story ends where all true stories end, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding, with warmth where once there was cold, and with the gentle, enduring light of a life honestly lived.